Idaho Freedom Foundation, and I just want to thank you again for being here and for the opportunity to speak to you and to speak to elected leaders, to speak to the governor if he happens to be around. Maybe he can watch this later if he's not here. But for years, the Idaho Freedom Foundation has provided Idahoans with clear tools to evaluate government performance. The Idaho Freedom Index has helped bring more conservative legislators to the Capitol, driven more conservative voting records, and improved the quality of legislation moving through the process. 5 years ago, we expanded our work at the Idaho Freedom Foundation to include an Idaho Spending Index, tracking how legislators vote on budgets and spending bills, and how the governor votes on them. The results are troubling. In the 2025 legislative session, the average spending index score was 39%, meaning 61% of the time legislators were voting for bigger, bloated budgets. And we saw those budgets pass. That is not conservative budgeting, and it is why Idaho now faces a self-inflicted spending and tax deficit. For years, we have documented the state's rapid spending growth, 60% increase over the last 6 years. Just a few years ago, you may remember, Idaho had a $2 billion budget going into a legislative session. At that time, the Idaho Freedom Foundation was still recommending restraint on spending so that the government would not overcommit to programs that they would not be able to sustain when the tax collections were not coming in quite as high. In fact, if the government had done that, there would have been plenty of room for significant tax cuts right at a time when families were struggling under Biden inflation. Those warnings were not taken seriously, and today Idaho is feeling the consequences. An old episode of the Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, he had then presidential candidate Ronald Reagan on his show. And Johnny asked him, how do you get the budget under control? How do you stop with the deficits? And Ronald Reagan turned to him and said, well, it's the same way you protect your virtue. You learn to say no. Now, Ronald Reagan couldn't even keep that promise. We did have deficits during the Reagan years, but I am urging our legislature and our governor to say no, to stop it with the excessive spending and excessive increases. Idaho does not have a budget problem. We have a budgeting problem. The whole process is rigged, is set up to encourage expansion. Agencies request their budgets every fall. Then the governor adjusts and tweaks them, and and brings them to the legislature. The Joint Finance and Appropriations Committee hears from the agencies. They will do tweaks and whatnot to the governor's budget. And then the legislature rubber stamps nearly every single budget the JFAC committee recommends. And so the whole process rewards the voting on bigger and bigger budgets every year. The final product is a stack of maintenance budgets and enhancement budgets, growing government and spending more year after year. The process rewards spending, not restraint. It creates photo opportunities and warm feelings among legislators and the governor for sporting new programs and projects, but leaves the taxpayers, the families, with higher bills and fewer options for genuine tax relief. Inflation and population growth do not justify these spending increases. I'll say that again. Inflation and population growth do not justify the magnitude of the spending increases we've been seeing. The expansion goes far beyond those. You will hear more about the numbers from our team in a moment. Today, the Idaho Freedom Foundation is offering a different approach. A conservative budget for Idaho is built on a limited role of government, a focus on what is necessary rather than what is simply desirable, and a return to stable, sustainable funding levels that existed before the rapid growth of COVID spending sprees in recent years. A conservative approach makes room for real tax relief. Repealing the grocery tax and phasing out property taxes could both be done, while ensuring the core functions of government are funded responsibly but not recklessly. Our policy team will walk you through how Idaho reached this point, what the real numbers look like, how a conservative budgeting framework will correct the course. Fred Birnbaum, our senior policy fellow and former legislative affairs director, will explain Idaho's recent budget history and the extent of the current fiscal imbalance. He'll be followed by Brett Ferrugia, our budget policy specialist, and he will outline our conservative budget for Idaho and the path toward long-term sustainability. The rest of our team is here, including Sam Lair, our Center for American Education Director, Ray Slip, our Policy Director. We have Sarah Clendenin, Jake Wyman, Rebecca Gordon, and Parrish Miller are also here. Our team brings decades of experience in budgeting, policy analysis, and legislative research. They are well prepared to explain the situation clearly and offer practical steps forward. After our presentations, we'll remain here for informal conversations and questions, one-on-one basis. We'll mingle around. Again, thank you for attending. Let's turn the floor over to Fred Birnbaum. Fred.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Fred Birnbaum with the Idaho Freedom Foundation. As Ron alluded to, I'm going to talk about how we got here, which I guess you can see if you look at the chart. I've been observing, critiquing, and commenting on Idaho's budget process since the 2015 session. And coming out of the 2008-2009 housing bubble, Idaho quickly ramped up state spending once the recession ended. And the state has continued to grow government spending at every opportunity. No reflection, no looking back, just government growth. The surge of federal money that came with COVID was supposed to be used for one-time items like capital projects and deferred maintenance, with the view that spending growth would recede once the federal COVID funds ended. What we've observed is a continuation of COVID-era spending, even though COVID is in the rear-view mirror. It's time to get back to the pre-COVID spending baseline. Let's start by reminding ourselves what's actually in Idaho Code Section 673533. And just for reference, that's the code section that the legislature put in place when they accepted the ARPA money. ARPA stands for the American Rescue Plan Act. For those of you who remember, that passed during the Biden presidency. There wasn't a single Republican in Congress who voted for it. So what I'm going to read to you is what's in Idaho Code. I won't take too much time. And think about that in terms of where we are now. And this is actually the sort of the preamble of it. ARPA funds are borrowed from our grandchildren. To the extent allowable under law, the state should make long-range investments with ARPA funds that will benefit our grandchildren. And some ARPA funds were used for things like bonuses, which was hardly a long-term investment. Next part. In accordance with Section 67 Idaho Code, the principle that one-time funding should be used for one-time expenditures, state agencies receiving ARPA funds shall plan for the reduction of these federal funds to avoid creating ongoing obligations that are shifted to the general fund after the federal funds are depleted. And as you can see, the reduction is not evident when you review total spending. And finally, the use of ARPA funds should not impede or inhibit the state's constitutional mandate to provide for a balanced budget for the people of Idaho. ARPA funds should be used to maintain a long-term, structurally balanced budget such that ongoing revenue should exceed ongoing expenses. ARPA funds should also be used to lower the state's capital costs and deferred maintenance costs in the years ahead. And so that's why we believe we're at this point. We didn't follow what was put into Idaho Code when we accepted the money. Yes, some of it was used for capital projects and deferred maintenance, but a lot of it was used to fund ongoing spending. And those of you that say, well, it's really the tax cuts that have put us where we are, and we can talk more about this one-on-one, revenues continue to grow despite all the tax cuts. They've only flattened out very recently. And what COVID did was flood the state with enough money to grow spending and cut some taxes. And that's why we're in the situation we're in. So here we are. It's not a time for postponing tough decisions, but for boldly facing the budget challenges with the correct response, which is spending reductions. It's never too late to reduce government spending. Let's do it this session.
Hello, I'm Brett Ferrugia with the Idaho Freedom Foundation. It has been my job as the budget policy analyst to take a comprehensive view of the budget and the agencies that comprise it. The IFF has produced the budget you are now looking at from that work. The budget proposal is modeled on the state's own process for building the budget each year. The upcoming legislative session, the state will face a projected budget shortfall when including tax conformity to Trump's One Big Beautiful Bill of anywhere from $600 million to $1 billion if a better path is not chosen. This is not merely a consequence of what many have characterized as a revenue shortfall, but rather it has been precipitated by the spending that the state has embarked upon since the beginning of COVID, now over 5 years ago. This is why the Idaho Freedom Foundation is proposing a bold yet attainable budget that aims to return Idaho to inflation and population adjusted pre-COVID spending levels and stabilize the finances of the state for the long term. We are here to outline a budget that cuts nearly $1.9 billion from the 2027 agency requests to help make this goal a reality. Now let's quickly go over these charts, which will help us understand our starting point before we outline the IFF budget in a little more detail. The chart on my right has 3 lines that map out different budget scenarios over the last 7 years. The red line shows the total historical appropriations. The blue line shows what the budget would amount to only removing Medicaid expansion. The green line shows the entire budget if it had only grown at the rate that would be prescribed by actual inflation and population growth, also excluding Medicaid expansion. The difference between the red and green lines is therefore, for fiscal year 2027, the goal for the IFF budget reductions, amounting to just under $1.9 billion. The pie chart on my left indicates those reductions, of which there are 4 central pillars. Let's take a closer look at those categories. The Idaho Freedom Foundation has reduced a budget that includes 4 central pillars on which the cuts will be based, and that will set the state on a path to fiscal sustainability. These are Medicaid expansion repeal, a true 3% general fund cut, a significantly larger cut to agencies that have grown faster than would have been predicted by population and inflation growth, and targeted cuts to specific wasteful and bloated programs. The most alarming trend facing the state is the unsustainable growth of Medicaid, specifically Medicaid expansion. The Department of Health and Welfare has acknowledged this growth pattern and has proposed and implemented a 4% provider rate cut to Medicaid providers. However, not only is this not enough to stave off a budget crisis, it harms the most vulnerable whom Medicaid was designed for while subsidizing Medicaid expansion recipients. Our state is already facing a fiscal crisis, and we should not be voluntarily subsidizing the able-bodied and their possible employers if they choose to work. The Idaho taxpayer was sold a false bill of goods when expansion was put to a referendum, and were incorrectly told that it would cost only around $400 million. By repealing Medicaid expansion, we will save $1.31 billion and come significantly closer to closing the budget gap in Idaho. The numbers speak for themselves, it being nearly triple the original cost estimate in only about 7 years. The second pillar of the budget cuts center around a true 3% general fund cut. The governor issued an emergency holdback of 3% to all general funds to address the budget shortfall, but exempted schools from this holdback, which itself is around half of the entire state's general fund expenditures. If we're really in a fiscal deficit, we should be cutting back across all agencies and programs. There should be no exemptions for any agency or program, especially unmerited ones. The savings to the state, if this cut were to be applied across the board, would be an additional $83 million. The third pillar rests on examining agencies that have grown significantly faster than population and inflation would have allowed for, which has been projected to be a cumulative 45% so already a significant number from July 20 to July 2027. While the 3% holdback acknowledges that all government spending is out of control, the IFF believes that agencies that have experienced the most growth should face the most scrutiny. This is why the Idaho Freedom Foundation is recommending a cut 6 times greater than that of the governor's holdback for each one of these overgrown agencies to restore fiscal sanity to the state and to spur agencies to better manage their ballooning costs. The savings to the state would amount to over $189 million. The fourth and final component of the IFF budget is the targeting of bloated, wasteful, and ineffective programs in order to get a handle on the budget. Much of the bloat in government is centered around bureaucratic and unnecessary agencies that spend without producing a meaningful benefit to the Idaho taxpayer, or large programs that are inefficient government giveaways to favored classes, and which are much better facilitated by private competition. Launch is but one example out of many. The full list of targeted agencies will be available in our budget, and we have recommended even further cuts submitted by IFF to the DOGE task force. Removing this bloat in government would save the state nearly $288 million. Our budget handout shows a breakdown of the proposed reductions to each and every agency or group of agencies, exactly how it would be presented to the legislators from the LSO in their budget and fiscal report. I'd like to highlight a few numbers. According to the DFM data for this fiscal year's 2027 requests, agencies are asking for over $14.5 billion all told. Our budget proposal totals $12.63 billion, or a 13% reduction amounting to $1.88 billion. This could amount to savings of $2,500 per Idaho household. We hope the legislature takes urgent action to address the immediate spending issues in Idaho and provide tax relief to all Idaho households. However, the IFF also hopes to support the legislature in pursuing real structural reforms to the budget process that will prevent these sort of fiscal problems from happening again by imposing sound fiscal and constitutional restraints on government spending. The Idaho legislature should take steps to ban the practice of off-budget spending and severely limit continuous appropriations. Further, the legislature should cease the practice of siphoning off funds from sales tax revenue to fund certain programs before these revenues even reach the general fund. These are just a few among the many tactics that serve only to obfuscate government spending to such a degree that it can barely be tracked, let alone controlled. Every dollar spent by the state should be comprehensively tracked, made accessible, and put into understandable terms for anyone willing to study the issue. Reform also means that the budgeting process should start in the legislature, be debated by the legislature, and end in the legislature. Our senators and representatives have been given the constitutional power of the purse, not agencies nor the governor. The IFF believes fiscal sanity can only be restored when the budget process is transparent and understandable and aligns as much as possible with basic accounting principles and the Constitution itself. I end with a remark from James Madison, the father of our federal Constitution, who once stated, "It will be of little avail to the people that the laws are made by men of their own choice, if the laws be so voluminous that they cannot be read, or so incoherent that they cannot be understood. So it is the same with budgets." Thank you.
There you have it. $1.9 billion of budget cuts, 13% off of where we are on a bloated budget, saving up to $2,500 per household from what is being spent in Idaho, and leaving tons of room for tax cuts. I want to reiterate that Idaho does not have a tax collection, tax revenue problem. Idaho has a spending problem. Thank you. A few little details here at the end. On the little handout you can find on the table over there, there's a QR code at the bottom. That is our main budget page. It has all the information, has these graphs, has everything we just talked about so that you can share it with your friends. You can peruse it and take your own time on it. And maybe you could even all share it with the governor. That would be awesome. Also on the table, you'll find some cookies that look like this. They're little money bags. If they're representing Idaho budget money, just think of it as your money already. You ought to get some of it back. And I want to thank Heidi Pearson for providing those. They're just awesome. Thanks. And one last thing, my media guy wants to take a quick picture. So if I don't know who's taking the picture. Oh, he wants everyone to come up to do a little photo op. But this concludes the formal press conference. We'll hang around here for questions, for informal conversation, and maybe a quick picture if you don't mind. Thank you. Come right up around here. Yeah. I'll come and talk to you. Yeah.
How much money will the Idaho Freedom Foundation focus out of the state, out of Idaho?
Great shots to put in their newspaper, whatever. Yeah, come right here and gather around the podium.